Tonight we have with us Wendy Kolie, who's the author of Lake Erie Murder and Mayhem. I sort of found this to be the perfect topic for late October. We have in the past tried to theme presentations, you know, Women's History Month or whatever, but I don't think I've ever themed anything to Halloween before. So I'm kind of excited to do that this month. There are many tales to be told, and I don't want to ruin any of them, but I will say I was surprised at these stories that Wendy has found. I've been up here and researching 20 plus years, and I don't think I knew any of them before. So that was really kind of exciting for me. They are bandits, pirates, con artists, and murderers. So it's really exciting. But with all of that, I'm going to introduce Wendy. Wendy Kolie is the instructional designer at Central Ohio Technical College. She holds a master's in teaching as well as a newly earned master's in the art of English. Wendy's been an avid Lake Erie lover her entire life and continues to visit and research the area to this day. And I will admit, I just found out is actually the author of 4 books. So I'm sure she will tell you all about them. So please welcome Wendy.
All righty. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. So I was up front visiting another lake lover here. We were discussing our love of the lake, and I turned around and there was the whole place was packed. So I'm like, oh, that's good news. I'd also like to thank Carrie for coordinating and her staff. They've been busy getting everything ready. Also, I'd like to point out that my mother has come with me. She comes along to some of these. It is one of the few times I get to boss her around, so she doesn't listen. And you know, like Carrie was saying, this is a great time of year for a spooky story. But what I also like about this area, I go all over Ohio and do these talks, but I love when I can talk where the lake is kind of my backdrop. So we got the river, we're close to the lake. And then also tonight, it's almost 3-pronged. So I got October, the Halloween thing going on. I have the lake, and then I'm also in, you know, a museum and a place where like I would do my research. So some of my favorite places is just setting this up for a perfect talk tonight. So I hope you enjoy. So I am going to be talking about my latest book, which is Murder and Mayhem. And let me make sure I know I didn't practice this part, but it looks like it's working there. So I do have 4 other books, and I used to just like skip through this part, but now I've added it into my presentations because people will always ask me, like, how did you get started writing? Where do you come up with your ideas? So I just added this into this presentation, and I'll do a quick little overview about my background with writing. My first book there is Geneva on the Lake, which came out in 2012. And growing up, I realized I liked writing and I liked history. So one day after I graduated college, couldn't find a job. I'm like, well, I could do something else for a while. So I decided I was going to write. And the Geneva on the Lake, it's on the other side of the lake. It's a resort town right on Lake Erie. But every year of my life, every summer for 1 week, my family, we would pack up into a car. So cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and we would stay at a cabin right at Geneva on the Lake, overlooking the lake. And it was the best times of my childhood. So I would look forward to it all year, better than Christmas. So when I decided to write, I'm like, well, I'm going to write about something that I really love and I'm very interested in. So that's where the first book came from. So after that book came out, I'm like, this is a lot of fun. I like talking. I like sharing my stories. So I went back to my publisher and we talked about a second book. Well, you know, that one came out in 2014. The next one, the Island book, in 2015. By this time, my publisher thought that I'm this Lake Erie expert, and I'm really not. But I will tell you that the history up along the lake shore, there's so much of it to be discovered that I could write another 4 books on that, just the subject of Lake Erie. So when the pandemic hit and I decided, well, this is a good time to write another book, my publishers automatically, well, is this going to be about Lake Erie? And I said, well, I guess I had enough research and things saved up that I really wanted to do another Lake Erie book. So that is how the 4th book came about. And I noticed that the theme of all these things that I had saved up were about crime and mischief and bank robberies and all that. So that is how the 4th book came about, and it was just released last year. So I will talk about that one tonight. So the first story I want to talk about is probably my favorite story, if one could have a favorite murder story in a book. And it is the first chapter in the book, and that's for a reason, because I just was so excited about this story. As Carrie said that, she didn't know about some of these stories. That's one of the criteria when I'm writing. I want stories that nobody else has wrote about or there isn't much known. That is so much fun for me to try to solve the puzzle and put the pieces and parts together. So this one, I could hardly find anything. I couldn't find much information, but I will tell you when we get to a certain part in the story where I ended up finding some really good information. But let me tell you a little bit about the CMB first. So the CMB was a luxury cruise liner. And if you don't know, between 1850s and like the early 1940s, the Great Lakes had lots of luxury cruise liners, and they would take people out to the islands and to the cities, to Detroit. And, but this one, if you look close on the front of the ship, you can see the letter C and then the letter B. And that stands for the Chicago or the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit line. So when they went to name the ship, then there was a play on words and they called it CMB. Now, this ship was one of the most luxurious of its time. So it had 4 decks, ballrooms, restaurants, saloons, and 100 staterooms that you could actually stay overnight on. So it was one of the few ships that allowed you to rent a cabin and stay overnight. Its most popular route was from Cleveland to Buffalo. And so it started to sail in 1912. And for the next 28 years, the CMB, it sailed pretty much incident free. So no fender benders, no tales of storms. I mean, it's an interesting, beautiful ship, but it didn't have, my kind of history, what I'm looking for, until the 28th year, which was also its last year in service, when tragedy did strike. And that was when a passenger seemingly disappeared off the ship. So a little bit about the passenger. It's the mother of this group here, and her name was Maureen Mosey. She was a skilled nurse. She lived in Alaska with her husband, Benjamin, and he was a U.S. Marshal. So the thing about Maureen is that she loved to travel. Now, this is 1940, so for a lady to travel by herself was kind of unusual, but it was her thing. Her husband supported it. She was good at it. They talked about how sometimes she would sail down by herself from Alaska to Seattle. It was just her thing. So in 1940, though, she decided she wanted to make a pretty long trip. So she was going to come down from Seattle or from Alaska to Seattle, from Seattle over to Cleveland. She had some relatives in Cleveland. She was going to stay there a few nights. Then she was going to hop on that CNB, that ship, and get over to Buffalo, where she would then meet relatives there, and they were going to go up to Connecticut. So pretty long journey. And as I'm thinking about her journey here, I'm thinking, well, of all that on that long train ride and all that, I would start to look forward to that little night on the ship. I would think that would be the easiest part, of her journey. However, that wasn't the case for her, because when the ship docked, so she got on July 29th, when the ship docked, she didn't get off. Now, does anybody cruise on modern day cruise ships now? I'm a cruiser. Okay, so if you didn't get off the ship, they would know you did not get off the ship. They would find you. But back then it wasn't like that. So they had a rough estimate of how many were on. She didn't get off the ship. Here's the thing though, she wasn't on the ship because the CMB turned around from Buffalo and went on back to Cleveland. And it did that more than once. In fact, it did that for 2 weeks. In the meantime, her stateroom is sitting vacant, except for her luggage is still in there. And on the bed is her dress, and it's laid out like she'd laid it out, to go for the next day, like ladies sometimes do. Now, how that went back and forth without anybody knowing is part of the mystery there. But finally, after 14 days of it going back and forth, the captain finally made a call to Cleveland and reported this. Here's the thing, while I'm doing my research on this, and like I said, there wasn't a lot, and I'm like, that is really strange. that for 14 days she wasn't reported. But one thing I noticed right away, the FBI got involved. I'm like, wow, they must have suspected something too. Well, I learned through research that if there is a crime out on the ocean or any of the Great Lakes, it's considered a crime of the high seas. That is when the FBI steps in. So they're involved right away because it's a suspicious, disappearance. As a researcher, that's invaluable to me because there's this thing called the Freedom of Information Act through the FBI, and you can provide them some information. This is all done over the computer. And I sent in this information about this case. I'm like, oh, it's 1940. They might not have anything. I waited a week, get this email back from the FBI. And it was a 200-page document about this whole investigation. Wow. Yeah. So like I said, as a researcher, that was invaluable because now I have the scoop. I know who they talked to, who they suspected, what happened. So I had to sort through that. It wasn't in any order, by the way. So that was a long process. But as I'm sorting through, then some things are starting to come together. One other thing that I do as a researcher to keep my mind, to keep things straight, like organized, is I always make a timeline of things. So I'm making this timeline of what happened with this particular situation. So on July 29th, I know that she got on this ship. So everybody saw her. That was that's where she bought her ticket. On July 30th, the ship docked in Buffalo. We know she didn't get off. And then August 13th is when she was finally reported missing. And we know in between that, the ship had been back and forth, back and forth. Here's the thing though, had she been reported missing, say on the 30th, even the 31st, I think we'd have a lot more answers in this situation, because on the 31st, a body washed up at Geneva on the lake. Okay, and that was weird because that was my first book. I didn't find that back in that time, but so this female body washes ashore, and at the resort, here's a little picture of the little resort. Came up by these cabins here, but of course they didn't know who she was. There wasn't any swimmers missing. They called Cleveland. Nobody was reported missing even from the beaches of Cleveland, and there 100% wasn't anybody reported missing from a steamship. So had they had that information, I think things would have been a lot different. So at Geneva on the Lake, then they call in their law enforcement, and a coroner came in, and they're like, well, we can't identify her, we'll try. And so they took a picture from her chin up, and they buried her in an unmarked grave. So now if you think about the story, then a couple weeks later, after she'd been buried, this story breaks that, oh, there's a passenger missing from a steamship. And the coroner in Geneva is like, uh-oh, okay, it's a female. And, he calls Cleveland, the FBI there, and they put it all together, and it was Noreen. So they exhumed her body. They sent her over to Cleveland. And if you know some of your Cleveland history, there was a famous coroner there that did so many autopsies. He was considered an expert. His name was Sam Gerber. But he did the autopsy. And if you watch crime shows, with an autopsy, you start to come into some clues as to what may have happened. So the first clue with the autopsy is that the coroner found that on the back of her head was a bulge or a bruise there. And then she had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of her head. Now, he said that it would have had to happen about an hour before she died. So there was that. But the most telling piece of this story is that when he looked under her fingernails, he found this greasy substance, and they went back to the ship, and on the ship, on the railings and on the rope, like the rigging there, it matched that same substance, that greasy, oily stuff that you find on ships. It was a match for that, like maybe she tried to hold on to something. So that was a pretty telltale sign. Also, they found out that the money that she had either on her in her room was missing. She had a diamond wedding ring on, it was gone. And then also in her room, they found a letter she'd written to her son, and she talked about how hot it was and that she was going to go up to the upper deck and cool off. So that kind of gave them this time frame of when this might have occurred, and they thought maybe between midnight and 3 a.m. With all that information. So with this, then they decided, well, it is a mysterious death. There's something odd happening here. So they started to come up with some suspects. If this is a murder, then we got to find some suspects. So the first thing they did is they looked to see if maybe she, did it to herself. Maybe it was a suicide. And one of the things that they did is they dug into her history and her life, and they made a call back to Alaska to her doctor. And he said she was in good health and good spirits. Her family said she was super excited about the trip, had talked about it for a long time. And she was an experienced traveler. So they ruled that out pretty quick. Now, if you watch crime shows or read crime, who's the next person they're going to look at? Definitely the husband. So we need to look at Mr. Mosey. Now, remember, he was a U.S. Marshal. And so they start digging into all that information. What was the marriage like? Did they fight a lot? Did he like that she was going traveling? And again, they find out that by all accounts, they had a really good marriage. He liked that she could do her own thing. He supported that. Now, as they're digging into this, they find something that kind of piques their interest. He had taken out a life insurance policy for travel in the case of a death during travel. And they're like, oh, hold up. So they go to this, where they took out this insurance, which was in Portland. And they start reading the travel insurance document there. And the interesting piece is that it said he would only inherit the money, which was $10,000. He would only get the money if the death was ruled accidental. Well, he was the one that had pushed the whole time that it wasn't an accident. So he said, no, I know something happened to her. I want this investigated. So my thoughts are, had he planned this or done that, he wouldn't want them snooping around. So he was ready to forfeit the money because he's like, no, it wasn't an accident. I will tell you about the husband though. Every time I do this presentation, somebody always comes up to me afterwards and says, it was the husband. I know it was the husband. I don't know how they know, but another character that they looked into, he has a name in my book, but I'm going to call him Mr. 421 because that was his cabin number. Reed's cabin number was 419. So if you think about a hotel or a ship now, how it's laid out, those would have been side by side. In of itself, it wasn't that interesting, except that Mr. 421 had been up to some mischief earlier in the evening. So he had been up on the top deck and he met a lady up there that he thought was attractive. And all I remember right now, I can't remember her name, was she had a green dress. So I'm going to call her Mrs. Green Dress, Miss Green Dress. But he made a suggestion to this lady. It wasn't Maureen, but he made a suggestion that he would like to see her room, see her cabin, what it looked like. So they go down to the cabin. Keep in mind, I'm reading the FBI report on this whole thing. And they get down there, and she said, this green dress said that he had different ideas once they got down into that cabin. He didn't want to just see the cabin. He wanted to see something, but I don't think it was the cabin. So she throws him out of the room. And just if you're reading these reports, you can tell he's mad still telling this story because they question him. But he went back up to the deck and he says that he got into the lounge chair and he slept there for the night. So that puts him up on one of the open decks up above. So he was a pretty good suspect, but they couldn't really ever pin it on him. Pretty suspicious, he's already been shunned by one woman. We know Noreen went up there. So he's a good candidate, but they never pinned it on him. Now there is one other person though that they wanted to investigate. There was a watchman on the ship, and what his job was from 10 p.m. till 8 or 9 in the morning. he would walk all the areas where any guests were allowed. So, you know, in front of the rooms, up on those upper decks, around the bars, he was just keeping an eye on everything. And so he would have passed Noreen's room several times. He would have been on those upper decks. But what really got the FBI's interest with the watchman is that he was a young man. He was about, I think he was 23. And right after this case broke, and there's these reports of this, something happened on the CMB, he quit his job. And when they said, well, why did you quit your job right at that time? He said, well, you know, it's just too hard on me. It's such hard physical labor and I don't want to do it anymore. So they thought that was weird. And when I'm reading this, I'm like, oh yeah, they finally caught somebody. This is going to be solved. But what they found out is a few weeks later, he went and had this major back surgery. So if he did it, he went through a lot to cover that up. So they did not pin it on the watchman. Here's the thing, this was investigated on into the next year, into 1941. And as I'm getting to the end of these reports, I start seeing where J. Edgar Hoover is making his signing on these documents, which was pretty cool. But he signed off that he could not rule that this death was anything other than accidental. So her death certificate does say that it was an accidental death. So to me, I have a lot of questions still. Usually people in the audience have some theories and a lot more questions, and how could that happen? And I don't think they could have got away with it in this day and age with cameras and computers and all that, but just an interesting story that was never solved. Now, as for the ship, you know, I said this ended in 1941. There was something happening in America. Does anybody know what that was? Yeah, so if you would go into research this on some newspaper databases, you're not going to find a lot about the conclusion of this, because this was taking over the papers, and rightfully so, it's huge news. But this is USS Wolverine. They took the CMB and they converted her into an aircraft carrier, which was unheard of. And it went overseas and was part of World War II. Now in 1948, they did bring it back and they scrapped the whole thing. So that is the story of the CMB in her last year. Keep your questions till the end, because I bet you have some and you're probably thinking, how did that happen? And so keep those in mind. Now, something as I'm putting this book together, you know, I'm finding all these people that are doing all these crazy things out on the lake, and they're really interesting. But I started to realize that the lake can cause trouble by itself. You don't need a person. That lake can do all kinds of things. And if you live close to the lake or you vacation, you've seen its many personalities. And there's times you would not want to be out on that lake. One of the most famous stories, if you do any kind of research or look up Lake Erie books, you will run into stories about the storm of 1913. So they called it the White Hurricane, one of the worst storms over the Great Lakes. And what, you know, it was a weird setup. There was hurricane-like winds, there was a blizzard, and they came together over the lake. And anything that was out there, which was in November, wouldn't have survived it. There was no chance. So after the storm, you know, some ships they never found again, and others they found floating abandoned, and just pieces and parts of ships were, you know, coming up on shore. So, you know, the lake has power to do its own thing. Here's a story where I think too the lake took part in some of the problem. This is a light ship, and if you're not familiar with light ships, so sometimes when they didn't have a lighthouse in certain positions, they would send out a light ship, and its job was just to sit there with lights on so that if other ships were coming along, they would know, like, oh, this is a sandbars under here, there's rocky outcropping, just beware of this area. Now this ship, the Southeast Shoal Light Ship, was closer to the Canadian side. But in 1909, there was an interesting story that I found that they hired this, he was going to be the second engineer, and they were going to send him out to the Southeast Shoal Light Ship. And right away, things kind of took a turn for the worse, because as he's getting onto the ship, he's complaining and acting like he doesn't like it there. And as the days wore on, by the way, this is July, and these things were made out of metal, so no air conditioning. So whatever's happening, and he doesn't like it already, you got the heat, you got the boredom, you got the loneliness. He's just not doing well with this. So they talked about how they would hear him crying at night, that he wanted to go home, things like that. And one day it was the hottest day. He really got acting strange. He said that he could see his parents who had passed away up on the rigging of the ship. So something's happening. Finally, it came to a head in late July when he, I don't know what he did actually. To tell you the truth, I do not know exactly what he did, but every article says that he tormented the other passengers, the other workers on the ship for 8 hours straight. I don't know what he did, but these were big sailors in that. There were several of them, and they were scared to death of him. No mention of a weapon. Not sure what happened, but he somehow tormented them. Now, they made a call back to shore, and they said, hey, you got to help us out. This guy's really losing it. So they sent these other ships. They sent another ship in to try to remove this fellow. And I don't know why this was so interesting to the newspaper writers. I hope maybe there's a newspaper writer out here, but what they focus on is how they got this guy off the ship. And I thought, oh, this is going to be very interesting. They lured him out with a piece of blueberry pie. That is the main focus of that article. I'm like, you can't say what happened, what he was doing. It was more interesting about the blueberry pie. But so anyway, this is another story where just the loneliness, the heat, the sitting there out on the lake, how the lake can kind of turn back on humans as well. One other story where I think the lake really did its part. This is out on West Sister Island, so one of the most remote of all the Lake Erie islands. The third lighthouse keeper took his family out there in the 1850s, and I think he had 3 daughters, but the oldest, she was 19, and she was a social butterfly. But he takes them out there to West Sister, where there is just a house and a lighthouse there. And people that would go out and visit said that her personality really changed over the years. So she went from this bubbly, fun young woman to this hollowed out, kind of depressed looking, quiet woman. And so within that year, then she went to the other side of the island, and she jumped off the cliffs and committed suicide. Again, I think it's just another piece of how the lake gets lonely out there. And back then you didn't have a cell phone, so probably wouldn't have worked anyhow. But that's West Sister Island. Okay, another thing that I ran across a lot of that I wasn't planning on adding into the book is these hoaxes. And I'm like, what is it with the lakes and people playing jokes? Why is that so much fun? But as I'm thinking about it, if you think about like a fisherman out on the lake, they're bored. They don't have TV. They didn't have cell phones. What else are they going to do other than to spin some yarns? So I think that's why hoaxes are like in connection with water a lot. However, hoaxes though can sometimes lead to major problems. So the latest story in my book, which was in 1975, happened when an SOS was sent on Christmas Day of 1975. And the SOS pretty much said, hey, we're out here by Pelee Island. There's 10 of us on this boat. We're stuck. The weather's getting bad. We can't get in. So could you send help? So Marblehead and Sandusky area, they send out people to start looking for this ship on Pelee Island. They make a call out there. People come out of their house and they're looking around from the shoreline. Even people on the other islands came out because they thought, well, maybe he's mixed up as to which island he's actually, struggling at. But they're not seeing anything. More rescuers are coming in. They send an ice cutter from Detroit, which is a huge piece of equipment, very expensive. They have planes. Of course, the weather is turning worse, and it's about the water's trying to freeze up, so they're trying to get through the ice. So they're out there all day. Well, finally they come back to Marblehead Life Saving Station there. And they say, you know, it's dark now, we're starting to get into danger. Should we go out? Because there's people out there, and you know, that's our job to rescue these people. What should we do? Well, as they're standing there talking, I think it was the Ohio Board of Communications calls, and they're like, hey, we were able to figure out where that SOS was coming from, and it wasn't coming from Lake Erie. In fact, it wasn't coming from anywhere near Lake Erie. It was coming from Zanesville, Ohio. So that's about 100 miles inland. So they send the sheriff to this house they think it's coming from in Zanesville, and he knocks on the door, and this 12-year-old boy answers the door. And, you know, I'm thinking he knows he's in trouble now. So his dad had got this SOS equipment for Christmas. He thought he'd give it a whirl. But, you know, with this, you know, all the money, the energy, those people missed their Christmas, they risked their lives, and he was just playing a joke. Now, I found this interesting. It wasn't connected and in the newspapers, but I just happened to stumble on it. That very same Christmas day, there was another SOS sent out, and they couldn't find out where that one came from, but it was sent supposedly from the Bermuda Triangle Christmas Day. So I don't know, I put two and two together, and I have some suspicions there where that one may have come from. Hey, speaking of hoaxes and tall tales, Lake Erie has several of these. So that first picture there you see of the lady going like that, that's the sea hag, the Lake Erie sea hag. If you're ever out there on a boat or a ship, if she shows up, you need to get off of that ship and get back to shore. There is the black dog of Lake Erie, another creature you do not want to see while you're out and about on the lake. Also, lots of stories of ghost ships, so ships that have probably sank, and now people are saying they see those. However, there is one tall tale, or maybe it's not a tall tale, could be true, that they talk about all the time with Lake Erie. If you're thinking about creatures, does anybody know who that is or what that is? Yeah, the Lake Erie monster. So this thing, I mean, there's all kinds of different drawings of that. It has been spotted since they started recording lake history. They have talked about a monster or something out in the lakes. Even the Native Americans had tales of something out in that lake. Now, here's the interesting piece of this. In 1931, over in good old Sandusky, they thought they finally had proof because two fishermen supposedly caught this thing. So we have these two men that had come up from Cincinnati, and they were carpet layers, but they were looking for work, which was pretty normal in those times. They come up through Cincinnati looking for work. While they're there, they're like, well, let's go out on the bay, Sandusky Bay, and do some fishing. So while they're out on the bay fishing, they said that they start seeing this creature kind of stalking their little rowboat. So they row a little bit, it comes a little bit with them. They row some more, it comes a little bit with them. So finally they had enough, and the one takes his oar and he beats it over the head. Okay, so they knock the thing out, and they tie a rope around its neck, and they start rowing back to shore, which I'm sure was a lot of work with this giant monster. They get back to shore, and this is where I'm starting to think, okay, there's something going on here. They supposedly like lay it out on the shore, and they measure it, and they see that it's 25 foot long. Here's where my doubts start really kicking in, because I'm like, if I found a monster out in the bay, I'm not going to come up and like play with it, measure it, and worry that it's going to wake up. But they said they did. They also happened to find this crate on the beach, and they put him in there and they nail it shut. So they go and they look for the police chief there. Now, In the meantime, the police chief's starting to investigate. By the next day, so you remember how I said that murder mystery didn't have much news coverage? By the next day, this thing has lots of news coverage. He made national news. So they are starting to look at this monster and think, well, maybe we did finally catch it. It's been a rumor for years, forever. So they call over this curator from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and they want him to have a look. So he comes over, and by this time the thing had been moved up into like a boathouse. Lots of townspeople were filtering in to see it, but he comes out and let me have a look, folks, back up. So he's looking in at this thing. And the first thing he notices is that it's very docile and very calm. You think if it was a monster in its cage, it might be pretty upset. As he's poking around, he notices the shape of its head, the length. And he's like, you know what? This is not a monster, it's a python, an Indian python. And at this point in the story, I'm like, well, I still wouldn't want to know an Indian python was out in the lake with me. It's still a good story. However, he goes on to tell that those Indian pythons, back when the circuses would travel, they always had pythons in the shows because they were so docile and didn't try to attack people. So the police chief's getting really annoyed now. Okay, they're making a spectacle of my town. These guys had given their real names, who they are, Cliff Wilson and Franson Bagenstos. He makes some calls, and Cliff had said, you know, I'm originally from Columbus and I live in Cincinnati. Well, he picks up the phone book, finds some Wilsons, makes some calls. He gets a hold of Cliff's uncle, and he said, hey, we got Cliff up here. He supposedly found the Lake Erie monster. We got it in a cage. And that uncle's like, Cliff doesn't do that. I don't know why he's saying as Lake Erie monster. He works with the circus. They were just in Cleveland 2 days ago. So that would make sense that he was in Sandusky. So anyway, then by the time the police chief goes back to have a talk with these two fellows, which I don't know what he was going to do with them, the two of them plus the snake had skipped town. So they were all gone. So I wanted to find out, you know, whatever happened to Cliff and his snakes. And he continued to travel with his snake show and tell about how he captured the snake in Lake Erie. It changed a little bit. Sometimes it was a snake, sometimes it was the monster. New story every city. This is the only picture I could find of him like actually at a circus, and it was for sale at an auction, online auction, so very expensive. But I love the picture because if you look, it's like a man-eating man killer, 30 cents. But if you look up where he's standing there on the stage, if it was a man-eater, would you only have that little bit of railing there? So I love that picture of Cliff and his snakes. Now, the story of the Lake Erie monster continues today. I know in the 1990s, they ran a contest trying to catch this. You could have won a prize. It was in the thousands. Lots of, you know, Cleveland.com will pick up this story. Usually around this time every year, there's some stories about the Lake Erie monster. I will tell you, you guys are on this side of the lake, and it has been most spotted on this side of the lake. So you got to be aware when you're, and beware when you're out there. All right, so this last story here is kind of a 2-for-1. So I have the Murder and Mayhem book, but I also have a treasure book. So this is going to be a 2-for-1 here. One of the things as I'm learning more about the lake and thinking about crimes on the lake, it really lends itself to a good crime. It's dark. If you have a boat, you can go fast. There's lots of nooks and crannies along the shore to hide in. And back before electricity, you only had the moonlight. And if the moon wasn't out, it was pitch dark out there. So the lake is a perfect place if you're wanting to, you know, pull off a crime. So in the 1850s, some, you know, creative individuals thought like I am, well, that's great. It's dark out there. I can really get away with something. So what they had did is they started, I don't know actually where they started, but they started on our side of the lake, and they made their way over to the Canadian side. And over there, they decided they were going to knock off a bank, and they landed at Port Stanley, and they go up the hill there, and they go to the business of robbing a bank. But back then it was those gold bars, it wasn't like the cash, it was the gold bars. So they're making several trips up and down back to their boat, loading that in there. Yeah, no alarm sounded, so they just climb back in their boat and they make their way back over across the lake. It's about a 60-mile trip. So I don't think they were in darkness the whole time. I think they were in broad daylight some of the time, but it's 60 miles across. I don't know how long that would have taken to row, but eventually they come in and it's dark again, and they see a lighthouse. They see one, the lights spinning at the top, and that kind of leads them into shore. This is Fairport Harbor over on the other side of Cleveland. And so that lighthouse kind of led them into shore. And when you're over there at Fairport, there's a river, sort of like this river out here, runs to the lake, and you can get in and out from the lake to the lake. So this is called the Grand River. So they proceeded to row up the Grand River about 2 miles. And as they get where they're ready to dock there, they had pulled off this great crime, all this cooperation and work. But when they parked there, a big fight breaks out between the three. You did all that work and now we're going to have a big fight. So the fight was how they were going to divide that gold. So I don't know, if one thought he needed more, if there was an unequal amount, but something happened that caused a huge fight. So the bigger of the three got out, and he had a gun and he shot the other two. So he supposedly buried them right there along the banks of the Grand River. Now he's got all this gold though, and a whole boatload of it. So he decides he's going to bury most of it. He's going to make this mental map of where it's at. He's going to take one for himself. The plan is to come back for that gold. If anybody's ever read a treasure story, they're always going to come back and get it. That's why it was left there in the first place. So about a year later, then this fellow pops up in Chicago. Another thing about a treasure story, there's always a deathbed confession. So he's very sick, and he wants to get this crime off of his chest. It's double crime. He robbed people, he killed people, he stole. So as he's laying there, he's telling his doctor, I got to tell you something. I did something horrible. I killed my 2 friends. And the doctor's like, oh, okay. He said, and then also we robbed a bank and I buried some money. Oh, you buried some money. Tell me more about that. So he tells the doctor, where the money supposedly is. The fellow passes away. Well, within the week, the doctor, the caring doctor that he was, sent a party from Chicago over to Fairport, which was quite the trip, to hunt for that gold. No results, no luck. The next year, the same thing. He sends a party over there, another maybe more skilled party. Still no luck. Now, this was in the late 1850s when this happened. So pretty soon, a few years later, we're entering into the Civil War. So I think this story kind of, fell out of the limelight. People forgot about it. We went into the war, the country's settling back down. And then in 1891, somebody, he wasn't hunting gold, but somebody was walking along the Grand River, and they find a skeleton there, and there was a bullet hole in the skeleton's head. So now the story, people are like, you know what? I remember this story when I was a little boy, and there's treasure and blah, blah, blah. And so this story resurges with a vengeance. Again, this is something that made national news. So people from all over, the sailors off the lake, are coming in to look for this missing treasure. Now, one article I read, there was a man, and he talked about how when he was a little boy, He thought the treasure was interesting, but what he really liked to do is sit up on the hills and he could see like the lantern lights of all the sailors coming in, and it was like lightning bugs down through there. They were serious about hunting that treasure. Oh, here's the thing, that treasure has never been found. It is one of the few treasure stories in Ohio. There's actually a lot of treasure stories here, but it is one of the few that they actually think is possible that it happened and that there could be something there. The problem is with the Grand River, over time, it has changed its course, and it's, you know, so 2 miles back then is different than 2 miles now. So another project, if you're not going to hunt the monster, maybe you could go look for the treasure. Again, it's I think it's worth $4 billion, they think, if it is there. Something interesting, last summer, a young man had contacted me and wanted some information about this treasure, and could I give him my documents? Where did I do my research? So I sent him everything I had, but never heard of anybody finding it. So I'm thinking he didn't have any luck. All right. There are several other good stories in the bank if you like a true crime story. So we have an Ashtabula bank heist, Lake Erie pirate, out on Kelly's Island. There was a triple murder and lots more murder. The fellow here in that picture, I feel like he's almost the inspiration for my book. If you look up on his collar there, he has a number. Well, that was his prison number. And I found out he did some crimes right out on this lake. But there's just something about him that I had to know more. And so that kind of like led to the story of the book. You would just have to know more about him. He is in the book, very interesting character. All right. Also, I do have the disasters of Lake Erie Islands. Lots of people will ask me what all islands I covered. I covered them all, even ones that people don't even know are there, ones that have disappeared, sank under the water. So they are in that book as well. All right, so now we are to the question and answer portion, which is one of my favorite parts because I like to know what people are thinking about and some of your theories about any of the stories. So I'm open for questions. Yes, ma'am.
On the first one, when she was traveling to go to Buffalo, wasn't she supposed to be meeting family there or going to, why did it take 2 weeks for her family to not report this?
Yeah, they did ask the family about that, and they assumed that she just stayed in Cleveland longer and that they didn't get the letter. When they were standing there, they thought it was weird that she didn't get off, and they checked back a few times and they thought, well, maybe she decided to stay over there. Now, I don't know why they didn't communicate that, but you know, they were devastated when they did find out what happened. But I think it was just, they thought, well, maybe we had the weeks mixed up or she stayed there or couldn't make it. They never dreamed it was, you know, now if somebody didn't get off a ship, we'd like really be scared. But I guess back then it was with travel and stuff, things could change pretty quick. But yeah, it's a good question.
I'm not sure what geography is that great, but isn't Geneva on the lake pretty close to Cleveland?
Yeah.
And is that east or west? If you look at Buffalo, is it in between the two?
Yeah, it's right. It's pretty close in between. And that's a good point because they also studied the wind and the wave patterns for that night. That also helped them figure out what time she may have went overboard based on where she washed up.
That's what I was wondering. If she left Cleveland and then Geneva was on the way, that would have happened. If it was on the way, it would have happened not very long after the boat left.
Yeah, you're right. And the ship actually left later than when it was supposed to. It was supposed to leave at 9 o'clock at night. It didn't leave until 11 o'clock. So you're right. It wouldn't have been too far past Cleveland once they were out there. And in that letter that she wrote to her son, she talked about that she'd watched as the lights of Cleveland disappeared, which was another clue of how far out were they? How far did she get before she went overboard? So all those factors played into how they narrowed that down between 12 and 3. She wouldn't have been too far into her voyage.
I'm sorry, did you have a question?
I got a couple here online.
Okay.
Also relating to your CMB, and I'll, sorry, because can you repeat the questions? again
Sure.
For our people online. This is just a simple one. How long did it take the CMB to go from Cleveland to Buffalo?
Okay, so the question is, how long did it take the CNB to go from Cleveland to Buffalo? It was usually, I think, about a 10-hour trip to go one way. And, you know, they wouldn't have been going as fast as ships now.
And the other question, I think is probably because we're in the season, were there any stories about her haunting the ship? After, I mean, obviously we knew it was in the last season of her vessel working, but.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did not find any stories because, you know, did sail for 8 years afterwards into the war zone. But I did not find any stories, unfortunately. Good question. Yes, sir.
The C&D, after it was converted into the aircraft carrier, I believe was sent to Lake Michigan. And it was used as pilot training there.
Oh, okay.
Take off.
And you know, there's lots of pictures too of when it had the planes there on it, so.
Yeah, George W. Bush, the first one,
Oh,
trained there.
well, that's an, I'm gonna have to get that information and add it in, thank
It's
you.
in the museum.
Oh, is it? Yes, sir.
Did you ever study a double murder or a triple murder? I think it was a double murder in the late 20s, perhaps 28, where they found a speedboat adrift out in Lake Erie near here,
Mhm.
and 2 guys came up missing, and here they were bootleggers, and they were probably knocked off. You ever?
No, not that story, but I thought you were going to talk about another one that is in the book where there was mysterious, it was in the 30s, and they had went out on the lake and a whole group of men disappeared.
Well, I knew this felt one of the dead people's son. I met years ago, and he told me the story and showed me the copy of the play there.
Oh, you'll have to come up afterwards and tell me more about that, because sounds interesting. Yes, sir.
The boat was also filled with bullet holes, so.
Oh. Oh, that is interesting.
Wasn't that a dagger? No, it's dark.
A dart, yeah.
Dark. A little bit dark, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the boat I have in my book was a dart as well, so
What was the boat filled with? What did you say?
bullet holes.
Bullet holes.
Oh, is it? Okay.
So, yeah, I'd like to hear more about that.
So, just because I got this, and again, it's sort of stemming off what they were talking about. Do you have any good in the books or any of your books? Do you have bootlegging stories?
So the question is, do I have good bootlegging stories? So like I said, when I wrote the book, I wanted to write about things that hadn't been done over and over. And there's tons of stories about bootleggers, and they're good stories and interesting, but there were so many, it was overwhelming. And then the best ones have been written about. But I will tell you one thing that I learned about bootlegging is that the best bootleggers, they believe, were women, because when women would come to the shore, the police weren't allowed to frisk them. So I'm like, well, maybe I could find a story about a woman sneaking in booze. However, she wouldn't have been caught. So there is no report or crime reports on her. So, yeah. There's a question back here. Somebody?
I was just wondering why no one checked the stateroom of this lady for 14 days. How long was her ticket for? The dress is laid out. No one reported anything. You know, that just seems very odd to me.
Okay, yeah, so the question is, how was that not reported? How did nobody notice that empty stateroom on the CNB? That was my question too, as I'm working through this story. There was a head maid, and she said that one of her maids that she was over had approached her like the second day and said, hey, there's an empty room down there and there's some luggage, but you know, I'm not seeing anybody coming and going out of that room. But the maid, her explanation, the head maid, her explanation was that was really common, that people would book passages on these cabins and then they wouldn't stay in their rooms. They would stay elsewhere on the ship. And so that was her story. And I didn't really like that. I felt like maybe she was covering up so she wouldn't get in trouble. She also said that it was a room that wasn't used that much. So to them, it wasn't a concern. I think that whole thing was suspicious and maybe they knew something was wrong and they didn't want to be in, somebody didn't want to get in trouble, and that prolonged it until like 14 days later. All right. Any other questions?
Usually a big question crowd. I think, when you have something, you're like, there is no final answer.
Yeah, the mystery.
You're sort of like,
Oh, we do have another question.
So there's a lot of commerce and industry on the lake, fishing, a lot of things, and there were heists for these goods, and then they would sell them. Were there any actually heists a whole ship, like they would capture a whole ship and anything like that?
No, but you remember the guy I showed you with the prison thing? So he is believed to be the last modern day pirate. And so when I found him, I'm like, okay, that's what I'm going to read about, that he's going to take over a whole ship. But that wasn't the case. He was on a ship and he was trying to rob a lady on the ship, and he got it for piracy. Now, he did try to kill her in the process, but they were more interested that he committed piracy. But with the also with the commerce too, I just thought of this. They were known to like try to steal the fish off of ships and the lumber and that. But as far as coming across a story, that would have went in the book for sure had I found one, but I didn't. And there may be some, and I just didn't find it.
what you working on next?
Oh, that's a good question. So when I talk to other writers, they have this issue as well. We think we have so many good ideas that we want to write about that it's hard to narrow it down. But definitely thinking about another Lake Erie book, anything water related. So I am playing around with a few ideas. So maybe in the next couple of years, I'll be back to talk about my next one.
Oh, there we go. All right, guys, thank you as always for coming. Wendy, thank you so much. For those of you, if you didn't pre-purchase a book, we do have books for sale, The Murder and Mayhem here. For those of you online, it is at our online store, nmglstore.org. Wendy also has her other 3 books that she's published with her, so you could purchase those from her tonight. If you did buy a book, she's happy to sign them for you, all blah, 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 blah. Our next lecture in the fall series, which will be the last one for this year, will be in 2 weeks on November 9th at 7 p.m. Sam Buchanan will be here to share all of his stories about working for the J.W. Westcott family. This is an extension of our temporary exhibit that we had this summer about bumboats and the J.W. Westcott company. So hopefully you guys can all come out for that. Somebody also reminded me that we have another program coming up, not just the lecture series. And so right after Sam's program, which is on Wednesday, that Saturday and Sunday, on 11th and 12th and 13th. Alan's not in here, so anybody knows. It's the Saturday, we're doing our Edmund Fitzgerald tours, where we take tours of the Colonel Jameson Schoonmaker and talk about the Edmund Fitzgerald and what happened that night. I didn't do it. What happened that night, and kind of compare and contrast and use the Schoonmaker as a way to talk about some of the things that are discussed when they talk about the Edmund Fitzgerald tragedy. So those you definitely have to sign up for ahead of time, and you can do that with Ashley up front, or you can do it on Eventbrite, I think, as you all of you have done. As always, please, if you are not a member, please consider joining us and becoming a member at nmgl.org/membership. Thank you for all of you that are here tonight. Thank you all of you on Zoom. Stay healthy and safe, and we will hopefully see you guys all again in 2 weeks. And have a great night.